I should have known something was wrong the morning Gerald handed me $200 in cash and told me to find something decent to wear. In 23 years of marriage, Gerald Holt had never once asked me to accompany him to a business event. Not one. I was the woman who kept the house running, who ironed his dress shirts, who had dinner on the table by 6:30 every evening without being asked. I was invisible by design, his design, and for a long time, I had convinced myself that invisible meant safe. "There's a reception downtown Saturday night," he said that Wednesday morning, not looking up from his laptop. "Morrison Capital just got acquired. The new owner's flying in from New York. I need to make an impression. And showing up alone looks desperate." I paused at the kitchen counter, coffee pot in hand. "You want me there?" "Don't read into it," he said flatly. "Just find something appropriate. And for God's sake, nothing flashy." Don't read into it. That was Gerald's way of reminding me that I existed in his life the way furniture exists in a room, useful, expected, and completely unremarkable. I spent 3 days searching consignment shops and discount racks with that $200. The dress I finally found was deep burgundy, long-sleeved, with a clean silhouette, $48 at a resale boutique on the East Side. The woman behind the counter said it had come from a designer sample sale. I pressed it carefully and told myself it was enough. It wasn't, according to Gerald. "That's what you're wearing?" He stood in the doorway of our bedroom Saturday evening, already dressed in a navy suit that cost more than our monthly grocery bill. His eyes moved over me the way they always did, measuring, dismissing, moving on. It was the best I could find. "Fine. Just stay near the bar. Don't wander. Don't bring up anything personal." He straightened his cufflinks in the mirror. "These are serious people." Serious people, as opposed to me, apparently. The venue was a restored historic building in the heart of downtown Cincinnati, vaulted ceilings, brass fixtures, the kind of place that whispered old money before you'd taken 2 steps inside. Gerald disappeared into the crowd within minutes of our arrival, already scanning the room for the right faces to attach himself to. I drifted to the far edge of the bar, near a column draped in white orchids, and stood exactly where I'd been told to stand. And that's when the room shifted. I felt it before I saw it, that particular hush that travels through a crowd when someone significant has arrived. Conversations dipped, heads turned. Near the entrance, a tall man in a dark gray suit had walked in, unhurried, with the kind of quiet confidence that doesn't announce itself. It simply is. My breath stopped. Because I knew that walk. I knew the slight tilt of his head, the way he paused in a doorway just long enough to take in the full room before moving through it. I knew the line of his jaw, the dark hair now threaded with silver at his temples. 31 years had changed Declan Marsh in all the ways time changes a person. But it hadn't changed him enough that I didn't know him instantly. Completely, in my bones. Declan Marsh, the man I had loved at 24 with the entirety of everything I had. The man I had left without a true explanation. The man I had spent 31 years trying, and failing, to stop thinking about. He was the new owner. Of course he was. I pressed myself further behind the column, my heart hammering so hard I was sure the woman standing 2 feet away could hear it. Across the room, Gerald had spotted Declan and was already moving toward him, hand extended, smile wide and rehearsed. I watched Declan accept the handshake politely, watched him nod at whatever Gerald was saying, watched his eyes begin scanning the room, methodically, steadily, the way a man searches when he's looking for something specific. And then his eyes found mine. The world didn't just stop. It went completely silent. 31 years of distance collapsed like it had never existed. And I was standing in a ballroom in Cincinnati feeling exactly the way I had felt the first time Declan Marsh had ever looked directly at me. Like I was the only person in the room worth seeing. He said something brief to Gerald and started walking. Not toward the bar, not toward the buffet tables or the cluster of executives eager to introduce themselves to the new owner of Morrison Capital. Toward me. Gerald turned, followed Declan's line of sight, and I watched his expression move through confusion, recognition, and something that looked very much like panic. Vivian. Declan stopped a few feet in front of me, and his voice was the same, deeper now, more measured, but unmistakably him. He said my name the way someone says a word they've kept carefully folded inside them for a very long time. Declan, I managed. He took both my hands without hesitation. His grip was warm and steady, and I felt something in my chest crack open like a window that had been painted shut. I've been looking for you, he said quietly, not loudly, not performing for the crowd, though half the room had gone still. He said it the way a person says something they've rehearsed in their own mind 1,000 times. Finally aloud, I've been looking for you for 11 years. Vivian, and I never understood why you disappeared. Behind him, Gerald's champagne glass hit the marble floor. Let me take you back to where this story really begins. I met Declan Marsh when I was 24 years old. At a regional architecture conference in Nashville where I was working as a junior project coordinator for a mid-size firm. He was 30 and already building something remarkable, a boutique development company that was starting to attract serious attention for its community-focused designs. We were seated at the same breakout session table, and he borrowed my pen because he'd forgotten his. You can keep it, I told him. I'd rather give it back, he said. That way I have a reason to find you again. It was that simple, and that was Declan, direct, unhurried, entirely certain of what he wanted without being aggressive about it. We talked through the lunch break and both skipped the afternoon sessions entirely. Sitting in a hotel courtyard until the sun went down and the conference staff started stacking chairs around us. He called the next morning. We talked for 3 hours. He flew back to Cincinnati the weekend after. Because I lived there, because he wanted to see the river I'd described, because he said he was running out of reasons not to. We were together for 2 years after that. They were the best 2 years of my life. Declan's company was growing quickly during those years, faster than he had planned for. New partners, new investors, new pressures. I watched him navigate all of it with a kind of graceful intensity that made me love him more every week. He made room for me in everything. Board dinners, weekend site visits, late nights reviewing blueprints across his kitchen table. I wasn't decoration, I was present. Which made what happened harder to explain, even to myself. His business partner at the time was a man named Walter Macy, older, well-connected, and deeply traditional in ways that only reveal themselves gradually. Walter had strong opinions about what the face of Declan's company should look like as it grew. Strong opinions about the kind of woman appropriate for a man in Declan's position. I wasn't that woman, according to Walter. I came from a working-class family on the east side of Cincinnati. My father had driven a delivery truck. My mother had worked checkout at a grocery chain for 20 years. I had gotten my degree on a combination of community college transfers and a state scholarship I'd applied for 7 times before receiving it. I was proud of all of that. Declan had never made me feel anything but proud of it. But Walter had a different approach. He didn't threaten directly. Walter was too careful for that. He suggested, he implied, he arranged conversations with investors in which Declan's personal life was discussed with raised eyebrows and careful language. He made sure Declan understood, quietly and repeatedly, that the company's growth was contingent on certain presentations being maintained. I found out about it accidentally, overhearing a phone call I wasn't meant to hear. Standing in Declan's hallway with 2 mugs of coffee, learning in 2 minutes everything that had been happening for months behind a conversation I thought was just about business. Walter was giving Declan an ultimatum. The company or me. And here is where I made the worst decision of my life. I didn't tell Declan what I'd heard. I didn't give him the chance to choose. I made the choice for him. Because I was convinced, completely, devastatingly convinced, That forcing him to choose meant forcing him to lose something he had worked his entire adult life to build. I loved him too much to let that happen. So I ended things. I told him I'd realized we wanted different futures. I told him I needed space to figure out my own path. I told him all the kinds of true enough things that people say when the real truth is too painful to speak directly. He didn't believe me. I could see it in his eyes. That particular look of a person searching your face for the real reason and not finding it. He called. He left messages. He drove to my apartment once. And I watched his car from my window for 40 minutes before he finally drove away. I moved 6 months later. Took a position in Columbus. Started over. And 6 months after that, I met Gerald Holt at an industry mixer, safe, established, uncomplicated Gerald, who wanted a quiet wife and a well-run house and never asked me anything that went too deep. I said yes when he proposed because I was 30 and exhausted from grieving. And I told myself that stability was a reasonable substitute for the thing I'd given up. 11 years into my marriage to Gerald, Declan's company had become one of the most respected development firms in the country. I followed his career from a careful distance, news articles, industry journals, his company's annual reports that I read alone in my car on lunch breaks. Feeling both proud and bereft in equal measure. 5 years ago, he had sold a controlling interest in his original firm and started a new venture focused on acquisitions and community reinvestment, Morrison Capital. I now understood, being one of his recent targets. He had been in the same city, moving in the same financial circles Gerald desperately wanted to enter. And I had been standing behind a column in a borrowed dress, hoping not to be seen. Gerald appeared at my elbow approximately 90 seconds after Declan's hands released mine. "We're leaving," he said, his voice low and absolutely rigid. "Gerald." "Now, Vivian." Declan looked at Gerald with the calm, measured expression of a man who is choosing his battles carefully. "Mr. Holt," he said, "I apologize for the interruption to your evening. But I wonder if I might have just a few minutes of your wife's time, privately. When it's convenient." "That won't be necessary," Gerald said. "I think it might be," Declan replied, and the quiet certainty in his voice made Gerald go very still. Gerald took my arm and we left. The ride home was 37 minutes of controlled fury, Gerald's voice rising and falling. The words washing over me in waves I barely registered. I sat with my hands folded in my lap, watching the city lights blur past the window. Thinking about the look on Declan's face when he'd said, "I never understood why you disappeared." He'd been looking for me. 11 years. Gerald's business card holder, the one I'd watched him set on the kitchen counter 100 times, was open that night on the entryway table. Declan's card was sitting on top, the simple white rectangle with black embossed text. Declan Marsh, managing partner, Marsh Capital Group. A cell phone number handwritten in the corner. I took it upstairs before Gerald could notice. I waited 4 days before I called. 4 days of Gerald's surveillance, sudden arrivals home from work, questions about my schedule, finding reasons to limit my time alone. He had never been physically threatening in our marriage, but control takes many forms, and Gerald Holt had mastered most of them over 23 years. I called from a coffee shop 3 blocks from my dentist's office on a Thursday morning. While Gerald thought I was at a routine appointment, Declan answered on the second ring. "Vivian." His voice was steady and warm, with something underneath it, something careful and hopeful at the same time. "I shouldn't be calling," I said. "You should," he said simply. "Can you meet me?" We met at a small cafe near the river. The kind of place with mismatched chairs and handwritten menu boards. Completely invisible to the kind of people Gerald associated with. Declan was already there when I arrived. He stood when he saw me come through the door. The way he always used to. The way men rarely do anymore. "You look like yourself," he said, which was possibly the most generous and accurate thing anyone had said to me in years. "You look like you've been busy," I said. He smiled, the same smile. Slightly asymmetrical, more in the left corner than the right. I have been. It helps. We sat across from each other. And for a long moment, neither of us said the thing that needed saying. Then Declan said it. Tell me what really happened. Vivian, all of it, because the story you gave me 11 years ago never made any sense. And I've spent a significant portion of the intervening decade trying to figure out what I missed. So I told him. I told him about the phone call I'd overheard, Walter's ultimatum. The investor pressure. The cold calculation behind Declan's professional future and my perceived liability to it. I told him I'd made the decision alone because I thought protecting his career meant I had to remove myself from it. I told him about Gerald, and the loneliness that had masqueraded as stability for 2 decades. Declan listened with his hands flat on the table, completely still, the way he listened when something mattered enormously. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Walter retired 6 months after you left, he said finally. His voice was very careful. His concerns about the company's image turned out to be connected to his own financial interests. He wanted a merger I wouldn't agree to. And undermining my personal life was leverage. He was gone by February. The ground shifted underneath everything. The reason I had walked away from the person I loved most had dissolved 6 months after I walked away. Walter was gone. The pressure was gone. The investors who had expressed concern had gone with him. And I had been in Columbus starting a new life with a man I didn't love. Believing I had made a noble sacrifice when I had actually just been manipulated by someone who stood to gain from our separation. I looked for you, Declan said, when you stopped returning calls. When you moved, I hired someone. Vivian. Twice. Both times the trail went cold in a way that felt wrong. A few years ago, I found out why. He reached across the table and placed a folded document in front of me. A legal summary, dense, precise, dated 18 months prior. Gerald Holt has known who I am for at least 7 years. Declan said. He's been in contact with Morrison Capital for longer than that. When my investigators started asking questions about you, they were redirected. Repeatedly, someone in Gerald's network was feeding them dead ends. I stared at the document without touching it. Gerald, I said. Gerald, Declan confirmed quietly. The night of the gala had not been accidental. Gerald had known exactly who Declan Marsh was. Had known that Declan had been looking for me, had spent years ensuring that search went nowhere, and had then, with extraordinary arrogance, brought me to the very event where Declan would be present, believing that his control over me was complete enough that nothing could happen. He had brought me along as a prop, never imagining I would become the center of the story. The days that followed were the most difficult and the most clarifying of my life. I went home from that cafe meeting and looked at my house, really looked at it. Perhaps for the first time, as the structure Gerald had built around me rather than a life we had built together. The marble countertops, the carefully curated art, the guest room I wasn't supposed to enter without notice. Even the garden, which I tended every spring, had been planted according to a plan Gerald had approved from a landscape architect he'd hired without asking me. None of it was mine. Not in any way that mattered. I called a divorce attorney from the parking lot of a grocery store on a Tuesday afternoon. Her name was Sandra Reeves, and she had a voice like someone who had heard everything twice and found none of it surprising. Is there financial documentation you can access? She asked. I manage the household accounts. I said, I've been managing them for 23 years. Even better, she said. Come in Thursday morning. Bring whatever you can. What I brought Sandra Reeves on Thursday morning was 2 decades of carefully kept household records, because that is what you become when someone makes you responsible for every domestic detail while keeping you financially dependent. You become meticulous. You record everything. You have documentation for things people with real autonomy would never think to keep. Sandra looked at the files for a long moment. You've been living on a controlled allowance for 23 years, she said. $200 a month for personal expenses, I confirmed, while managing a household budget in the low six figures. Yes. Sandra closed the folder and looked at me directly. Mrs. Holt, you will not walk away from this marriage with nothing. I can promise you that. Gerald's reaction when I told him I was filing for divorce was precisely what I had expected: controlled fury, followed by economic threats, followed by the particular cruelty that emerges when a man realizes the thing he has owned is attempting to own itself. He told me I would get nothing, that his lawyers would ensure the proceedings dragged out for years, that I had no marketable skills, no independent income, no references that didn't run through him. He was wrong about all of it, as it turned out, but he didn't know that yet. What Gerald also didn't know, what I learned from Declan 3 weeks into the proceedings, was that his relationship with Morrison Capital had not survived the acquisition. Declan's due diligence team had uncovered significant financial irregularities in the Morrison accounts that Gerald had been involved in managing through a consulting arrangement. The kind of irregularities that attract attention from regulatory bodies. Gerald's lawyers were suddenly considerably less aggressive. Declan offered me a position with his company during a quiet dinner in late October, not as a favor, not as charity, but as a genuine professional opportunity. His community investment division was expanding, and my 23 years of managing complex household and event logistics, along with the project coordination background I'd had before my marriage, made me a stronger candidate than he'd expected. You've been running a small enterprise single-handedly for 2 decades, he said. That's not nothing, Vivian. That's exactly what we need. I started the following January, the same week my divorce was finalized. The settlement Sandra had negotiated was fair: the house, a portion of the joint assets, and my financial independence restored after 23 years of managed dependency. I sold the house immediately, bought a small townhouse near the river that was entirely, completely, unconditionally mine. What happened between Declan and me afterward was not fast, and I am glad it wasn't. We had coffee, and then dinners, and then long Saturday afternoons walking along the river the way we used to when we were 30 and 34 and believed we had all the time in the world. We talked about the 11 years we'd lost, about the choices we'd each made in the aftermath, about the grief that had never fully lifted on either side. We were careful with each other, deliberate, 2 people who had been burned badly enough to respect the heat. He asked me once, on a cold evening in March, whether I regretted how things had unfolded. I regret the years, I said. I don't regret who I became inside them. I needed to become someone who could choose freely before I was capable of actually choosing. Declan thought about that for a while. You chose freely now? He asked. Yes, I said, completely. We were married 14 months after that night at the Gala, in a small ceremony at a botanical garden outside the city on a warm Saturday in May. No marble floors, no curated art, no carefully managed impressions. 60 people who genuinely loved us, seated among flowering trees, with a string quartet playing something that made Declan's youngest niece cry before the ceremony even started. I wore a dress I had chosen entirely on my own, soft ivory silk. Simple and long, with small pearl buttons down the back that took my friend Carla 20 minutes to fasten while she told me it was about time. Declan waited for me at the end of the aisle the way he had always waited, patiently. Certainly, with a stillness that communicated more than words. When I reached him, he took both my hands and smiled the way he had smiled 31 years ago in a hotel courtyard in Nashville when we'd stayed so long the staff had started stacking chairs around us. You finally came back, he said, quietly enough that only I could hear. I finally came back, I agreed. In the months since, I have thought often about the version of me who stood behind that column in a burgundy dress, hoping not to be seen. The woman who had spent 23 years making herself small enough to fit inside someone else's life without disturbing anything. She is not a stranger to me. I understand every choice she made. But she is not who I am anymore. I run a department now. I manage a team of 7 and work on projects that will outlast me. Community investment initiatives, affordable housing partnerships, educational outreach programs in the neighborhoods where I grew up. I come home to a man who asks my opinion before making decisions that affect us both. Who has never once told me what to wear or where to stand. I have a garden I planted entirely according to my own taste. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, Declan and I sit by the river and watch the light change over the water. And I think about how strange and unlikely and entirely necessary every step of the path was that brought us here. Some love is patient enough to outlast the forces that tried to bury it. Some people find their way back to each other, not despite everything that happened, but because of everything it taught them. And some stories don't end where they were supposed to. They begin there. Now I want to hear from you. What would you have done in my place, the night I overheard that phone call? All those years ago, would you have stayed and fought? Or would you have made the same choice I made? Leave your answer in the comments. Along with your city, I want to know how far this story has traveled. And on the final screen, I've left 2 more stories that our community has called their favorites. I think you'll understand why. Thank you for being here until the very end.